Boy doesn't even know what he's looking at. Garrett Finch's voice carried across the whole floor of the Caldwell County estate sale, loud enough that the woman running the register looked up from her clipboard. Somebody ought to tell him before he embarrasses himself further. The laughter that followed was the comfortable kind. The kind that comes easy when a room has already decided what it thinks. Elias Voss didn't turn around. He had learned a long time ago that turning around only gave people like Garrett Finch a face to aim at, and Garrett Finch had never needed much encouragement. Elias was 22 that April, with the kind of build that came from hauling equipment and not from a gym, and hands that were already starting to show the permanent gray stain of a man who worked with old machines. He had driven 2 hours that morning from Macon to this sale outside of Tifton, Georgia, because of 3 words in an online listing he had seen at 11 the night before. Restored Wurlitzer components. The listing had no photograph. It had a price of $80 and the notation condition unknown. And Elias had lain awake for an hour before getting up at 4:30 and pointing his truck south. What sat in the corner of the Caldwell sale barn was not what most people in that room would have called a Wurlitzer anything. It was a crate, really. A wooden shipping crate roughly the size of a hope chest, its slats gone dark with age, and one corner crushed inward where something heavy had once fallen against it. A paper label on the lid had mostly peeled away, leaving only a ghost of print and a curl of dried adhesive. The auction house had tagged it with a red sticker that said Lot 47, Miss Estate Contents, and left it at that. Garrett Finch was the man in Caldwell County who bought things at estate sales. He ran a resale operation out of a warehouse on the highway and drove a lifted black truck he'd had detailed the week before, and he had a way of standing with his arms crossed and his head tilted back that suggested he had already calculated the worth of everything in the room and found most of it wanting. He collected antique jukeboxes, had a dozen of them in a climate-controlled room above the warehouse, and he talked about them the way some men talked about horses. He had not bothered to open Lot 47. He had looked at the crushed corner and the missing label and kept walking, which told Elias everything he needed to know about what Garrett Finch understood and what he didn't. Elias had knelt beside the crate for a long time. He had not opened it either, not yet, not in front of the room. What he had done was press 2 fingers lightly against the slats near the hinge side and close his eyes. And what he felt through the wood was the particular solidity of cast iron and formed steel packed in aged paper wadding. Not furniture, not ceramics, not the loose rattle of miscellaneous junk. Whatever was in that crate had been put there carefully by someone who knew how fragile the right things could be. He had also seen, on the bottom left corner of the crate where the wood was cleaner, a stencil so faded it was nearly gone. 2 letters and a number, WL7. The WL series was what Wurlitzer had produced between 1946 and 1951. Elias knew this the way he knew the engine specs of his truck, not because he had studied it, but because it had been the subject of approximately 400 conversations over the course of his childhood, most of them at a workbench in a garage, on Pecan Street in Macon, where his grandfather, Eugene Voss, had spent 30 years repairing and restoring jukeboxes, while Elias sat on an overturned bucket and handed him tools. His grandfather had talked about the WL7 the way some people talked about a place they'd always meant to visit. One of the last of the 78 series before the format changed, he used to say, running a rag over whatever he was working on without looking up. Mechanism like a Swiss watch, tone like a choir. I've seen 3 in my life and only one that played right. You find a WL7 that's whole and honest. You're holding on to something the world forgot to take care of. Eugene Voss had died 8 months ago, in August, in the same garage on Pecan Street, sitting in his chair beside a 1954 Seaburg he had been restoring for a customer who never came back to claim it. He had gone quietly, which was the way he had lived, and Elias had found him there in the early evening when he'd stopped by after his shift at the repair shop where he worked days. And he had sat with his grandfather for a while before he called anyone because he wasn't ready to let the room change yet. The estate had left Elias nothing because there was nothing to leave. The shop tools, a few $100s in a checking account, The unfinished Seaberg, which the customer eventually took without apology. What Eugene Voss had left his grandson was not a thing you could inventory. It was an education conducted entirely in the language of things that were broken and could be made whole again, and the patience to tell the difference between a machine that was gone and one that was only waiting. Elias had $80 in his wallet. He had driven 2 hours. He had pressed his fingers against a crate and felt something that no one else in the room had thought to feel for. He raised his hand when lot 47 came up. The auctioneer, a thin man in a bolo tie who ran through lots the way a man reads the weather, without particular investment, started the bidding at $25. No one moved. Elias called it out from where he was standing, back left, near the door. 25. He felt the room shift the way a room does when it notices something unexpected. Garrett Finch turned from where he was talking to a man near the front and looked at Elias the way a man looks at a dog that has walked into his kitchen. Then a slow, appreciative grin spread under his beard and he raised his own hand. 40. It was not that Finch wanted the crate. Anyone watching his face could see he didn't want the crate. What he wanted was visible in the way he half turned to his neighbor and said something low that made the man snort. He wanted the pleasure of watching a young man who didn't belong here spend money he didn't have on something he didn't understand, and Garrett Finch had never needed a better reason than that. 50, Elias said. 60. Finch didn't even look at the auctioneer. He was watching Elias the way you watch something you've already decided is entertainment. 70. A few people had turned now. The woman at the register had stopped pretending to look at her clipboard. The auctioneer was doing his job with a little more energy than he'd had 5 minutes ago, going back and forth between them like a man watching a tennis match he hadn't expected to enjoy. 80. It was everything Elias had brought. He said the number in the room heard it land, and for a moment there was nothing on the other side of it but Garrett Finch's expression, which shifted from amusement to something closer to performance. He raised his hands in a wide, magnanimous gesture and shook his head. "Let him have it," Finch said to the room, not to the auctioneer. "I'm not going to take money from a kid who doesn't know what he's buying. Son," he called out, loud, friendly, the kind of friendly that has a blade in it. "You understand that thing's sold as is. No returns in this business. No refunds when you get home and find out it's full of somebody's old Christmas ornaments." The laugh that moved through the room was not cruel exactly. It was the laugh of people who thought they already knew how the story ended. "Going once," the auctioneer said, with the weariness of a man closing a joke. "Going twice. Sold to the young man in the back for $80. Elias paid in cash, counted out in 20s, and did not look at Garrett Finch while he did it. He borrowed a hand truck from the sales staff and moved the crate himself, which was heavier than it looked, which meant it was heavier than most people wanted to deal with, which meant they hadn't. He got it loaded into his truck bed with the focused quiet of a man who has decided that the only audience that matters is the work itself. Finch was still inside when Elias pulled out of the gravel lot. He did not look back. The drive home took 2 hours and 11 minutes. For most of it, Elias didn't turn on the radio. He drove with both hands on the wheel and the crate rattling slightly in the bed on the curves and let himself feel, just for the space of those miles, the full weight of what he'd done. $80 was not money he had to spare. He worked 46 hours a week at a small appliance and electronics repair shop on Cherry Street. And after rent and the truck payment and the cost of keeping himself fed, $80 represented roughly a week and a half of whatever was left over. He had spent it on a feeling in the wood and a faded stencil and the voice of his grandfather in his memory. Talking about a jukebox he had only ever seen 3 times, it was possible he had bought $80 worth of old Christmas ornaments. He thought about that for most of the drive, the way you turn a stone over to see what's under it. He thought about Garrett Finch's face and the laugh that had moved through the room. And he thought about the last time he had sat in his grandfather's garage, 2 weeks before Eugene died, watching the old man's hands move over a mechanism, with the particular slowness of someone savoring the work. His grandfather had not been a man who talked about himself much. He had talked about machines. He had talked about the logic inside them, the way a good design was almost like an argument, everything in its right place, nothing wasted, the whole structure holding together because each part did exactly what it was supposed to do and trusted the other parts to do the same. He had said once, when Elias was maybe 12 and frustrated with a mechanism that wouldn't cooperate, that a machine wasn't stubborn. It was only honest. It did what its condition allowed it to do. And if you didn't like what it was doing, you had to understand the condition first. Elias pulled into the lot behind his apartment building a little after 8 in the evening. He got the crate inside with a furniture dolly and a great deal of patience. He lived on the second floor of a building that had not been designed for large deliveries, and by the time he had the crate on his living room floor, he had scraped his knuckles twice and apologized to the wall once. He stood over it in the lamplight and let himself breathe. Then he got his pry bar. The crate opened the way old things open, reluctantly and all at once, the nails letting go of the wood in a sound like a slow exhale. The slats came off in order, and Elias set each one aside, and inside was the aged paper wadding he had felt through the wood, and inside that, wrapped in it with a care that had not diminished in however many years it had been sitting, was the reason the crate weighed what it weighed. He unwrapped it in sections. The top panel first, the Wurlitzer-branded arch with its bubble tubes intact, not cracked, not yellowed past recovery, intact, the colored liquid in them still present and settled. Then the selector mechanism, the pilaster columns still mounted in their frame. Then the amplifier chassis pulled free of its paper wrapping and held up to the lamp, and Elias turned it slowly in his hands, reading it the way his grandfather had taught him to read a thing, not with his eyes only, but with the whole set of his attention. What he held was the amplifier from a Wurlitzer 1015. Not a WUL7, something better. The 1015 was not a jukebox his grandfather had only seen 3 times. It was the one Eugene Voss had talked about the way people talked about an experience that changed them. 1946. First year of the bubble tubes. They called it the bubbler, his grandfather used to say. There were about 56,000 of them made. You know how many are left in working condition? Not enough. Not nearly enough for what they were. Elias sat down on the floor of his apartment. There was more in the crate. The turntable mechanism wrapped separately. 3 of the 4 corner pilasters. 2 trays of 78 Marvison records still in their paper sleeves, dusty but uncracked, titles visible when he tilted them to the light. Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Jordan, The Ink Spots, Nat King Cole. And at the bottom of the crate, under everything else, wrapped in a piece of chamois cloth that had gone stiff with age, a brown envelope with the flap tucked in rather than sealed. He opened it with the same care he'd given everything else. Inside was a letter, handwritten in the deliberate script of someone for whom writing was an effort and therefore worth doing slowly. The date at the top was March 1959. The signature at the bottom was a name he didn't recognize, Calvin Reese, and a title beneath it that took him a moment to read in the lamplight. Proprietor, Reese's Rhythm Room, Macon, Georgia. He read it once fast and once slow, and the second time through he set it down on his knee and looked at the ceiling for a moment before he picked it up again. The letter was addressed to no one, or rather to whoever finds this, which Calvin Reese had apparently considered sufficient. It explained, in the plain language of a man with no taste for excess, that the Wurlitzer 1050 to which these components belonged had been the first thing he had purchased for the Rhythm Room when he opened it in 1947, and that the Rhythm Room had been one of the few establishments in Macon at that time that would let black musicians perform on a proper stage for a proper audience, and that the jukebox had played every night for 11 years, until the city had found reasons to shut the Rhythm Room down that had nothing to do with the reasons they gave out loud. He had packed the jukebox carefully because he had believed he would open another room one day. He never had, but he had kept it packed and moved it 4 times over the years because he could not bring himself to sell it, and he was getting old now and his children had no use for it, and he was writing this letter and putting it in the crate because he wanted whoever found it to know what they had. He wrote, This machine played the music that let people be free for a few hours when there was not much freedom to be had. I would like it to play again. I would like it to play somewhere people can hear it. That was all. No instructions, no conditions. Just the history and the wish. Elias sat on his apartment floor with the letter in his lap until his back began to ache. And then he sat a while longer. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about the fact that Eugene Voss had spent his whole working life in Macon, repairing machines, and had never once mentioned Calvin Reese or the rhythm room, and whether that was because he hadn't known or because the story was one of the ones Macon preferred to keep quiet. He thought about what it meant that this machine had been packed away the year. Elias's grandfather was probably a young man, sealed into a crate by a man who had kept faith with it for the rest of his life, and then passed through whatever hands it had passed through to end up in a sale barn in Tifton tagged as Misk. Estate contents at $80, waiting for someone who would stop and press their fingers against the wood and feel what was inside. He did not sleep that night. That was not quite accurate. He dozed at some point in the early hours in the chair beside the crate, with the letter on the table and the components laid out carefully across the floor. And when he woke to the gray in the windows, he was already thinking about the amplifier. The restoration took 11 weeks. Not because Elias was slow. He was not slow. He had been trained in the specific logic of mid-century audio mechanisms since he was old enough to hold a screwdriver, and he understood the 1015's design with the fluency of someone who has learned a language young enough that it doesn't feel like learning. But he was one person working evenings and weekends, and the machine deserved to be done correctly, and correctly in this case meant finding original parts when he could and fabricating precisely when he couldn't, and it meant not sleeping much and spending every dollar he could free up on components and not telling anyone at work what he was doing in his apartment because he didn't feel like explaining it yet. The bubble tubes were the hardest thing. 2 of the 4 border columns had tubes that had lost their seal over the decades, and the liquid inside had evaporated down to a dark residue at the bottom. He sourced replacements from a collector in Indiana who sold them individually for more than Elias wanted to think about, and he drove to the man's house on a Saturday to pick them up in person because he didn't trust shipping on glass that old. The amplifier needed 2 capacitors replaced and 1 tube, which was the easy part. The turntable mechanism needed careful cleaning and a new drive belt and a great deal of patience with the tone arm assembly, which had seized in a way that looked worse than it was. The selector mechanism, the part that let you flip through song titles and choose, had a sticky cam that he spent 3 evenings cleaning and lubricating until it moved the way Calvin Reese had expected it to move in 1947. The records he cleaned by hand, sleeve by sleeve, with a solution he mixed himself and a soft cloth, and he found that most of them were playable, and that the ones that weren't could be set aside without loss because there were enough that were. He did not tell anyone what he was doing. He was not ready to. His mother called twice during those weeks, and he talked to her about other things, and his friend Marcus, who he played basketball with on Thursday evenings, asked why he seemed distracted, and Elias said he had a project going, which Marcus accepted, because Marcus had known him long enough to know that projects sometimes required silence. What he did, toward the end of the 7th week, was look up Calvin Reese. It was not a straightforward search. Calvin Reese was not a name that had made it into the local newspaper archives in any substantial way. There was a mention in a 1952 piece about Macon's entertainment district that listed the Rhythm Room among a half-dozen establishments, and a brief item in 1958 about a zoning dispute that Elias read 3 times because of what it didn't say. What it didn't say was why the city had decided that a building on that particular block needed to meet specifications it had never been required to meet before. And what it didn't say was why 3 of the other establishments named in the 1952 piece were on the same block and had also closed within 6 months of each other. And what it didn't say was what happened to the people who had run them. What he found eventually, through an archive of a black-owned newspaper that had been digitized by a university library and was searchable only if you knew where to look, was a small obituary from 1991. Calvin Reese, 74, retired, survived by 2 daughters. Former proprietor of several Macon-area businesses, including Reese's Rhythm Room, which operated 1947 to 1958, and was noted for presenting live musical performances. 11 years of a place where people could be free for a few hours had been condensed into 8 words by the time anyone thought to write it down. Elias found one of the daughters. Her name was Cora Reese Addison, and she lived in Atlanta, and she had a Facebook page that she didn't use very often, and Elias wrote her a message that he deleted and rewrote 4 times before he sent it because he didn't know how to say what he needed to say in a way that wouldn't sound strange. He settled on the truth, stated plainly. He told her he had bought a crate at an estate sale in Tifton. He told her he had found her father's letter. He told her what he had been doing for the past 7 weeks and what he hoped to have to show her at the end of it. She didn't respond for 9 days, which was long enough that he had started to assume she wouldn't. Then she wrote back 2 sentences. I didn't know Daddy still had that machine. I would very much like to see it. Cora Reese Addison was 67 years old, and she drove from Atlanta alone on a Sunday, and she did not call ahead when she left, which meant Elias got her text from the road when she was already an hour out and had to rush clean his apartment in a way that he recognized, in the back of his mind, would have made his grandfather laugh. He had the machine assembled in the corner of the living room, where the floor lamp could light it properly. He had waxed the cabinet the night before. The bubble tubes were running. He had learned to run them in shifts to preserve the heat life of the lighting elements, and the color moved through them in the slow, perpetual way that had made the design famous, amber to red to blue-green and back, a light that had no impatience in it anywhere. Cora stood in his doorway for a moment before she came inside. She was a small woman with close-cut gray hair and her father's deliberate way of taking in a room, and she walked to the jukebox the way you walk towards something you had decided you were prepared for and find that you weren't quite. She put her hand on the cabinet, flat-palmed, not patting it, but resting her hand against it the way you rest a hand on a shoulder. She stood like that for a while without saying anything, and Elias stood back near the kitchen and did not interrupt her. He used to let me sit on top of it, she said finally, not turning around. When I was very small, before I was old enough to understand it wasn't a chair. Elias didn't say anything. He talked about this machine my whole life, she said. After the rhythm room closed, he talked about it the way you talk about a person who moved away, like it was somewhere. She turned then and looked at Elias with the particular clarity of someone who has been deciding something for the last 9 days and has reached a conclusion. Does it play? He had loaded 5 records. He had thought about which ones for longer than he wanted to admit, standing in front of the selector with the sleeves spread out on the table, reading the titles in his grandfather's voice, and he had chosen the way his grandfather had taught him to choose a first song for a restored machine. Not your favorite and not the safest. The one that will tell you what the machine has to say. He dropped a coin. He pressed the selector. The mechanism moved the way Calvin Reese had built it to move in 1947, smooth and certain and without hesitation, and the tone arm found its position and the room filled with the sound of a Nat King Cole recording that had been sealed in paper for more than 60 years and had not lost a thing. Cora Reese Addison put her hand over her mouth. She stood that way for the length of the song, and when it ended and the mechanism reset with the quiet efficiency that had been the Wurlitzer engineer's particular gift to the world, she sat down in Elias's chair and looked at the floor for a moment. My father, she said, was a good man who spent a long time being told that what he built didn't matter. He kept that machine packed in a crate for 30 years because he believed it was worth keeping. Everybody in this city has forgotten the rhythm room. You could ask 100 people on the street and not one of them would know the name. She looked up at Elias. How old are you? 22, he said. She nodded slowly, as though that were an answer to a question she had already been asking herself. What happened next took several months, and the kind of sustained effort that doesn't make for a clean story, because it is mostly phone calls and emails and meetings, with people who have to be convinced of things they should not need convincing of. Cora had the connections in Atlanta that Elias didn't have, and Elias had the machine and the documentation. The letter, the newspaper references, the photographs he had taken at every stage of the restoration, and together they had something that a Cultural Heritage Foundation was, after some initial skepticism, prepared to take seriously. The Wurlitzer 1015 from Calvin Reese's Rhythm Room was accepted into the permanent collection of the Macon Museum of Arts and History 6 months after Elias had driven to Tifton on 4 hours of sleep and a feeling in the wood. The director of the museum was a careful woman named Patricia Odom, who had spent 30 years preserving exactly the kind of history that tends to go unpreserved, and she understood immediately what she was looking at when Elias and Cora brought the documentation. She used a phrase that Elias wrote down and kept. She said, "This is an object that held a community's dignity at a time when the community wasn't allowed to hold it anywhere else." There was a ceremony on a Saturday in October, and the Rhythm Room Jukebox was placed in a newly installed exhibit on Macon's mid-century Black cultural history, in a room that had not existed before the museum found the funding to build it. The bubble tubes ran. Nat King Cole played through the original amplifier. People who were old enough to remember stood in the doorway of that room the way Cora had stood in Elias's doorway, with their hands at their sides and their faces doing something they hadn't expected. Garrett Finch was not at the ceremony. Elias had not looked him up or thought about him much after that morning in the sale barn. He had been too busy, but someone had, because a local news piece about the museum exhibit mentioned that the jukebox had been purchased at an estate sale in Tifton for $80. And someone who knew Garrett Finch read that piece and mentioned it to him. And the story of Lot 47 made its way around the antique and resale community in a way that those stories tend to make their way around. Elias heard about it secondhand, from the man in Indiana who had sold him the bubble tubes and had been following the story online. He said that Finch had not taken it particularly well. Elias received this information and did not spend much time with it, because there was nothing in it that changed anything. Cora Reese Addison gave a short speech at the ceremony that Elias would remember for the rest of his life, not because of any single thing she said, but because of the way she paused in the middle of it, looking at the machine in its case, and said quietly and without apparent intention of being overheard, "Daddy would have liked this boy." Elias stood in the back of the room where he had learned to stand. He wore a jacket he had bought for the occasion. He watched the bubble tubes move their patient color through the glass, and thought about his grandfather, who had spent 30 years repairing things the world had given up on, and who had died in his chair beside an unfinished machine, and who had never once told his grandson about Calvin Reese or the Rhythm Room or the music that had played there for 11 years, while the city was busy deciding it didn't matter. He thought about what it meant that the knowledge had been passed down anyway, not as information, but as a way of paying attention, as a set of hands that knew how to press against wood and feel what was inside, as the patience to kneel down and listen to a thing instead of deciding in advance what it was worth. The machine played. The room was full of people who had come to hear it, and somewhere in the fact of that, in the $80 crate and the 11 weeks, and the letter from a man who had only asked that the music play again, somewhere people could hear it, was the kind of justice that doesn't come with a verdict or a gavel. It comes quieter than that, and it lasts longer. There are people in your life, and maybe you know one, who see something in a thing that everyone else has walked past, who stop where others keep moving, who press their hand against the wood and feel what's inside before they decide whether it's worth the trouble. The world tends to laugh at those people, right up until the moment it doesn't, and the ones who do the laughing almost never understand what they missed. But the ones who stopped, they know. They carry it the way Elias carried his grandfather's voice on that 2-hour drive home from Tifton. The way Calvin Reese carried his machine through 4 addresses across 30 years. The way a thing that is worth keeping will always find, if it waits long enough, the person with the right hands to hold it.